Good evening. My name is Nadia Resnikoff. I'm a sixth grade teacher in the Middle Country School District. I'm the president of the Middle Country Teachers Association, and I'm a member of the board of directors of NYSUT. I'd like to thank the Long Island, New York State Assembly legislators for the opportunity to address you today regarding the Common Core Learning Standards. It's time for New York State to make urgent changes. For the sake of our students, we need to get it right. Parents across New York State are receiving their children's individual scores on the new, significantly more rigorous state tests administered last spring. Student scores have dropped dramatically, exactly as the state education department predicted, with 2/3 of failing to achieve a proficient score. Parents are understandably shocked and outraged to hear that their children's scores plunged, and they are justifiably anxious about broad brush statements that their children are not college and career ready from grade 4, 3 on. Similarly, school districts across the state recently completed new evaluations for teachers. Like parents, teachers are understandably shocked and outraged to see that these evaluations, incorporating flawed student test data, too often fail to reflect the reality of student progress, and in many cases bear little relationship to their own effectiveness as dedicated professionals. This year's performance data is meaningless. It doesn't accurately measure student achievement or teacher effectiveness because, despite repeated warnings from teachers, parents, administrators, and superintendents to slow down and get it right, the state education department proceeded with the premature implementation of Common Core testing. The result, thousands of students were tested on material they had not yet had time to learn or was developmentally inappropriate for them. As was stated earlier, we have 8th graders who aced high school Algebra Regents exams they took, but performed poorly on the state's 8th grade math test. Clearly, the only thing these tests show is that the state is still not able to measure student and teacher performance accurately. These meaningless scores are based on bad data that in isolation are misleading and hurtful both for teachers and students. I believe New York State's interpretation of the Common Core is developmentally inappropriate. A first grade ELA module from SED said that reading and writing should be taught through the content of ancient Mesopotamia, as one of you mentioned. It would include how it was a river valley civilization, ziggurats, the Code of Hammurabi, and cuneiform. First grade. This is what is covered in 6th grade social studies and high school. Whatever happened to community, neighborhoods, towns, reading and writing through their own personal experiences so maybe they could relate to it? Students were exhibiting signs of severe stress on the day of the test. Many students put their heads down on their desks and they cried. Many were physically ill and weren't able to partake in the remainder of the school day. By failing to provide the time and capacity to implement the new learning standards in a quality way, New York State is endangering the very reforms intended to advance teacher development, student learning, and our shared mission of closing the achievement gap. New York State is falling short in providing resources to get it right. New York State's public education system is under tremendous stress caused by shortfalls in funding. Adequate resources for public education are essential if students are to achieve at higher levels. Yet, as classes began, school districts were burdened with less state aid than they received in 2009, and by the constraints of a restrictive and undemocratic tax cap. Despite the aid restorations contained in the 2 most recent state budgets, close to 3/4 of school districts are receiving less state aid than they were 5 years ago. The state's fast-forward timetable includes SED's expectation that future Common Core assessments will be computer-based, perhaps as early as 2015. While in many of our resource-strapped districts, as one teacher put it, the few out-of-date computers we do have are missing keys. Districts need the time and funding to introduce technology necessary to meet state requirements. Pearson, the publisher of these New York states, is a for-profit company that creates, owns, and charges for the resources that align with the Common Core learning standards. Who profits from our students' failing scores? If New York State is serious about raising achievement by all students, it must invest far more in public education. That includes funding for materials aligned with standards and the technology needed to support them, reasonable class sizes, additional instruction and support for students who need it, and funding for a rich, comprehensive education that goes beyond fill in the bubbles to produce thinking citizens. In order to implement the Common Core learning standards effectively, we need to put the brakes on to allow for them to be gradually phased into each grade level so that there are no gaps between the previous curriculum and the Common Core curriculum.
That's an interesting theory, phase it in, that's interesting. I like that idea, phase it in.
We ask you to support teachers and parents in our call for best practice in measuring student achievement and for necessary transparency in the state's use of standardized tests. As you know, NYSUT supports bills that would require transparency, not only about the millions spent on standardized tests, but also about the frequency and duration of student testing, the loss of classroom instruction time, and the real impact on student learning. Well-designed standardized tests tied to high academic standards and align with classroom lessons should be only one of many tools used jointly to assess student progress, evaluate teachers, and inform instruction. No single test can accurately and fairly reflect all the many factors that go into teaching and learning. Teaching is as complex as the students we teach, and no single data point can account for all the educational and societal factors that influence what happens in our classrooms. Unfortunately, the state test scores released last month are of little help. Teachers are barred from seeing all the test questions or the acknowledged correct answers and using them to improve instruction. Districts are unable to use these results for meaningful professional development that would promote student success. We are calling for a 3-year moratorium on high-stakes consequences for students and teachers, including postponing the implementation of the Common Core Regents exams as a graduation requirement. SED plans to administer new exams this school year based on Common Core in Algebra 1 and English Language Arts, alongside the traditional gold standard Regents exams. SED also intends to begin using Common Core Regents exams as a graduation requirement for students who start 9th grade next year. Implementation of these exams should be delayed for 3 years to forestall a drop in Regents scores and graduation rates similar to the recent plunge in grades 3 through 8 test scores. If high schools were to parallel what happened in elementary and middle schools this year, it could mean that only 1/3 of our students would graduate high school. It's time to listen to the common sense voices of parents and teachers. We've been told we should accept this bumpy ride because the rush to implement requires building a plane in midair. This is a formula for a mid-air disaster. We've been told that these major changes must be done in a hurry because at some point you need to throw children in the deep end to see if they can swim. As teachers who work our hearts out every day on behalf of the children in our care, that's not acceptable. It's time to pull our children out of the deep end and devote the time and resources they need to achieve the higher standards. Getting it right means respecting the voices of educators and parents. We ask you to support us together with parents as we continue to fight for the future of public education. We ask you to get it right. We ask you to ensure that the Common Core learning standards are developmentally appropriate for students. We ask you to provide in full the resources districts need to ensure all students have an equal opportunity to master the new Common Core learning standards. We ask you for sufficient time to gradually implement the Common Core learning standards. These standards should be developmentally appropriate. We ask you to gradually phase in the Common Core learning standards. We ask you for a 3-year moratorium on high-stakes consequences for students and teachers. We ask you to postpone the implementation of the Common Core Regents exams as a graduation requirement. We ask you to support teachers and our parents in our call for best practices in measuring student achievement and for the necessary transparency in the state's use of standardized tests. We ask you to ensure that the Common Core learning standards and standardized tests are not about big business, but about kids and improving public education. And finally, we ask you to respect and listen to the voices of educators and parents. Thank you.